I'm Zach Johnson.
I'm Mitchell Hora.
And this is the Fieldwork Podcast, where we have open conversations about adopting sustainable ag practices, what's worked, and what are the challenges. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the economics of nutrient management. Obviously a big topic, important topic. There's a lot of stuff that really comes into play when we're talking about nutrient management. You know, crop selection, soil type, climate, hydrology, lots of different things that go into this topic.
Well, but I like this topic a lot, that I think this is something that every single listener has to pay attention to.
Yep.
You know, when we were talking about conservation and whatnot on some of our other episodes, that's a little different for each person, but every farmer can improve their nutrient management. We got a couple guys here in the studio with us to be able to help to talk about that. Brad Carlson is with the extension here through Minnesota. He's an extension educator. And farmer Mark Bauer is down in southern Minnesota. Thanks, guys, for coming in and joining us. We won't botch up your intros too much. We'll let you guys tell us about what you're seeing in your day-to-day work, especially as it pertains to nutrient management.
Well, I work a lot with issues related to nitrogen use. My work has evolved a little bit over the years, but I think we all recognize a lot of the more recent issues related to nitrates, particularly here in Minnesota. If you go back maybe about 10 years or so ago, when the Gulf Hypoxia Action Plan came in place, that led to the development of Minnesota's nutrient reduction strategy. Of course, there's a major component of nitrogen related to that. And then, of course, the recent reboot of the Groundwater Protection Act that's led to a kind of a focus on nitrates in drinking water and groundwater. And so there's just a lot of activity related to that. I'm a soil scientist by training, and so this has kind of been the area I've worked in my whole career, and it's never been busier.
Awesome. So I guess maybe just to make sure we have everything right. So, Brad, you know, with your stuff with the university, you're mostly out in the field implementing some of this stuff, or you're working from the university on the plans and the programming, or?
Oh, so I'm an extension educator. So that's part of the land grant mission is to do outreach to the people. So I teach primarily farmers, ag professionals, work in the ag industry extensively. Of course, we do have a component of that goes to the general public also. But it's strictly outreach education. So I do a lot of work with workshops and speak at meetings, do quite a bit of media work. We do press releases. We do our own podcast. Our nutrient management group on campus has a podcast that we talk about various crop production topics related to using fertilizer, so forth. And so it's really a smattering. In fact, my signature program that I've been involved in now the last 4 years is called Nitrogen Smart. And it's working extensively with Minnesota corn growers on trying to be proactive on nitrogen management issues and issues related to water quality. And so we're in our 4th year of doing in-person trainings with that program, but also then this year we first went live with it online also. So we've also got some online training under our belt too. And so I think as everybody can realize, as technology is evolving, so does the delivery methods for our education and information. So that's going to continue throughout my career, and probably the pace will pick up too.
Also with us, we've got Marc Bouwer. Mark, you're a farmer from southern Minnesota, doing a lot to look at the economics of the nutrients on your farm and try to maximize profitability. Not necessarily always highest yield, but what is the return on investment, and how do you manage those nutrients to work with that? So tell us a little bit about who you are and what you've got going on your farm.
Well, my wife and my son and my daughter, we farm about 1,700 acres in that Northfield, Faribault area. But nutrient management in our operation, basically it's a salt of the earth, organic method of figuring out how little can I get by with. Fundamentally, I suppose, from a theory standpoint, I should say that I am the ultimate tree hugger. I love the rivers. We spend all our free time on the waters, and it's a shame to see what's happening to them. But in reality, I don't do any of that stuff. And the fact of what we're doing to get efficient, if it's beneficial to the river, great. But that's not my driving force. My driving force is I want to make money. I want to be efficient. And your comment earlier kind of threw me off. You said that the higher yields weren't really important to me.
I guess if I wasn't implying that. I was saying, that my understanding is that you're trying to maximize profitability.
Correct.
And so trying to maximize profitability and trying to maximize yield can be two completely different things.
But it doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be.
Yeah, you can do both.
See, and
Why don't you tell us how to do that?
That's one of the stigmas. That's one of the stigmas that will come into the guys that are no-tilling, and we kind of get labeled as we're willing to sacrifice yield to cut out certain processes and passes. We're making less passes. Okay, we can justify less passes. We can justify less yield because we're making less passes. That's a myth. That's a myth.
What have you kind of seen? Maybe what's some of the specifics that you've seen on your farm, and what's that journey been? I suppose too. When did you start getting into?
Once I started to fly the ultralights around, low and slow. We were treetop to 1,000 feet, but you would really, when you go scouting, you literally go scouting. And what I saw covering 50-mile radius around my home yard was to me it was extremely obvious it was not sustainable. The biggest resource, I worked my whole life trying to obtain land, and the most foolish thing to me is to let it wash away. Again, I'm not a tree hugger. I really, downriver, whatever, I really don't care. Mm-hmm. I want to build my asset base. And the number one thing I can do to retain my asset base or make it grow is to keep the soils there, increase the productivity. Erosion is a big driving factor. But the nutrient management part, with that said, highly variable nutrient needs came from the aspect that certain fields were being covered with lots of hog manure, or maybe you had half a field got covered and the other half didn't. So there wasn't, I had to be flexible as we're applying nutrients in certain areas and zones. Some zones had no organic nitrogen or fertilizer to rely on, so it had to get a full load. So we were variable rate and stuff anyway, and it just kind of evolved. And then once we started backing down on the livestock part of it, I knew I had to get maximum efficiency out of the primary asset that I worked my whole life to obtain, was land. I had to make it as productive as possible, as efficient as possible, and to me was where the nutrients need to go,
So what was it that you saw from the ultralight that really sort of woke you up to this? Was it erosion? Was it you thought nutrient mismanagement?
Unprecedented variability.
Just variability in general
within
of
the
everything.
Fields, within the fields, right. Yeah. As you traveled, wherever you went. I flew over the Waseca area, Mankato area, down in through Minnesota Lake, back up around over into towards Austin and back home, and then get down towards the Rochester and the hills over by Zumbro Falls and that type of area. So
in just seeing
within field variability was just ludicrous this day.
So you were just seeing, but you were flying over the crop in the season.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So as the crop was growing, you're seeing there's so much variability here. We need to think about this different.
What are we doing wrong?
Yeah,
right.
Why is there so much variability? But also, it sounds like that we need to manage that variability better.
Exactly.
And that we need to treat the soil as at that subfield level.
Not
and be able
only
to work with it.
Figure out what the soil is telling us.
Yeah.
Maybe those soils that aren't, they just don't have the same yield potential. So let's pull back on what we're feeding them.
So flying over your fields now, do you see less variability on your fields?
Unbelievable.
You do?
Absolutely. And now they got, like you were saying, Pioneer calls it Encirca or something like that. My agronomist is using that type of firmware. And we're trying to figure out if we're doing test plots now with fungicide application. And there's different plots we got going with different nitrogen rates And then we're doing things by adding micronutrients to our late season nitrogen application to see if we can pick it up from the Encircia photo imagery from satellite, I think it's from.
Yeah, it's satellite imagery.
And it's really hard to pick it up, where he says he's showing me literally on other farmers doing kind of the same type of test strips, but with different types of tillage. So there's obviously different soil health ratings, scores. And you can really see the variability from them using those, whether it's enzyme packages or it's, humic acid packages or micronutrient packages, late season boron with your side dress nitrogen. It's not showing on ours, where the soils that
they're more imbalanced and whatnot.
Well,
they're more imbalanced and they're responding and whatnot. Maybe more.
They're less predictable on predictability is probably not the right word, but variability. They handle weather extremes.
They're resilient.
They're not as resilient. I really believe our soils have become more resilient.
Yeah.
And just the aspect that they've become more erosion resistant. What a nice thing.
I love it.
That was not my primary goal.
I'd like to tell a little story on Mark, because I've known Mark for 24 years. This is my 25th year in Extension. I started with a local appointment in Faribault, and back in the late 90s, we had a research project we were looking at. Mark had a field he was running. It wasn't land that he owned, but Mark was installing his own drain tile, and we actually got LCMR funding from the state to do a trial monitoring water quality coming out of the drain tile, and we were put in some piezometers, some shallow groundwater wells and so forth. We were taking water samples from, and Mark got really impatient with the research project. What we did is we split the field in half, and he tiled half of it and left the other half undrained. And at one point, I said to Mark, you knew this project was going to be a couple of years. Why are you getting so impatient with this? And he said, I've kind of decided I need to get all my drainage in order, because as soon as I get this all in order, I'm going to farm differently. And I started asking him what that meant, and he started laying out this vision of reducing his inputs, of decreasing his tillage, of basically of what a lot of us would define as stewardship of the land. But from his standpoint, he was looking at I needed to get all my variables under control, and then after that, I can start farming differently. And Mark, maybe then you can take it from there on what kinds of things you started to do at that point.
Well, I've always experimented with ways to do less, and the natural one is to go to no-till. What can I do with no-till? So 10 years experience with that, and we found huge variability depending on what Mother Nature dealt us.
Variability meaning sometimes the no-till was good and worked fine, and sometimes it didn't?
Right.
Okay.
Right. You got 1 year where you figured you thought you had it figured out. The next year you followed the exact same process and amounts that you're putting down for nutrient and starters, and it was very successful. The yield was very comparable to within the same field where I was doing it, spending an extra $150 an acre in tillage, and the no-till was literally matching the yield. So you're thinking you got it. Okay, I've got the system dialed in. I got it figured out. And the next year you would go, try and expand upon it, or you repeat the process again. So the only variable left is Mother Nature. And Mother Nature would shuffle the deck, and you got a bad hand, and the yield was catastrophic. Like where the yield would be half of where we done the more conventional methods of tillage. So we just kept working from the standpoint, what can we do to make it more consistent?
So as far as being able to kind of implement a new system, like I said, you've gone through some ups and downs, and I think a lot of us, as we're trying to implement and do things different, we had those same kind of ups and downs. Can you dig into a little bit more on what was your thought process, or what did you do to overcome some of those issues and be able to stay the course? How did you not get frustrated and be able to still kind of carry on?
one of the things I would say, looking at, for instance, university recommendations, is a lot of people think that that's average, that half the time you needed less than this and half the time you needed more. In a lot of cases, recommendations actually are designed to encompass most situations. So in a lot of situations, you actually need less nutrients or less tillage or so forth. The problem becomes how you decide when those situations are, if we're going to be more prescriptive with our management. And so that gets into if you're going to manage in a way that takes away that risk. And I think that's really a lot where Mark is at with a lot of his timing, with the way he's accomplishing tillage and fertilizer application and so forth. When you start taking away a lot of that risk of extreme situations, of not being able to get out in the field, and other things that relate to the risk, and so you might want to say something about how you manage some of that.
Right. That's a good point. How do you The ultimate denominator is managing the variabilities you're given in a given year. And again, the ultimate trump card is Mother Nature. You're never quite sure what hand you're going to get dealt, and so you have to be flexible and coming up with a system. And how do you get through it? How do you not get frustrated and just abandon it? There's mentors out there. You find people that are successful at it. Maybe one of my mentors was in Wisconsin, another one was in the Quad City area, very successful with it, and you take and you bounce their sounding boards back and forth. Yeah, we've experienced this, we've experienced that, but they keep, it kind of comes back to, if you get it figured out, you're going to be severely rewarded. And then as recently as 10 years ago, soil health started to come into the topic, where guys were starting to figure out. The guy in, drawing a blank now on his name, out of Michigan, was one of the...
Ray Rawson?
Ray Rawson, one of the founders, one of the really true pioneers that figured out a system that worked for him, that year after year after year, no matter what the weather was, he found very predictable yield results.
Being able to be resilient in the soil.
Yes. So then he became a really strong mentor. He developed some machines that we rented machines from, that he was in manufacturing through Underfirth and Brilliant and those types of companies. We leased one of them for a year and tried them, and found in our soil types that had some severe limitations. My soils tend to be rockier, and it was a huge obstacle for us. But we fought through on a few acres, and then we did that for a couple of years, and we found the same result he did, predictability. But the manageability, managing the additional labor, with the stones that we had to deal with, the extra fuel consumption, it was pretty extensive tillage. I came up with in talking with him and guys that were working with his system, that had worked with it longer than I had in our types of soil. They were already learning. Again, it's homegrown organic knowledge, that they didn't need to be as extensive as he was. And so they were developing, and Ray was helping them to build and develop stuff for their area that was less aggressive, and they were finding similar results with predictability and good yields. And then we kept evolving, and we literally got to a point about when Brad was talking about, we were doing that tiling study. That's where the feeling or the knowledge came from, the standpoint, if you're going to reduce tillage, you better get your subsoil drainage in order. Trying to fix a wet spot by hitting it with the field color or extensive tillage just wasn't the answer, So if you're going to reduce tillage, get your drainage in order, then the reduced tillage becomes another step more predictable.
Sure.
So that was our first step.
Yeah, and that moved right into how you're applying fertilizer, because Now you've also, since you're doing strip tillage, you're also applying your fertilizer too. And so it really, when you talk about a system, it really kind of was that way because the drainage led to reduced tillage, which led to the ability to apply fertilizer in the springtime, no longer looking at applying nitrogen in the fall, as well as the ability to apply it splits and so forth that allowed you to also kind of start cutting back on rates. And
well, also with that is the more site-specific application of the nitrogen management part of it, because we're dealing with higher and higher levels of residue. So nitrogen tied up with the carbon source wasn't a good thing. So then we started to get more site-specific.
So when we talk about nutrient management and we talk about nitrogen, which I think we can probably all agree that when you're talking nutrient management, the first one you're probably going to look at, the big one is nitrogen. I mean, that is the big one. Brad, you've got the Nitrogen Smart Workshop where you go around and educate farmers on nitrogen. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what exactly you think it is that farmers really need to understand about nitrogen and some of the key points?
Well, a lot of it goes back to things they probably learned in a high school ag class or in a college soils course if they had agriculture training in college, or maybe picked up somewhere else along the way too. But it gets into just simply how nitrogen behaves in the environment, the nitrogen cycle. So the transformation from our soil organic matter mineralizes and releases nitrogen into the soil. Our applied fertilizers will move from ammonium, which is a positive ion that doesn't move through the soil, and converts through microbial action into nitrate, which being negative is not retained in the soil because our clay particles in the soil are also negative. So it's like having the two negative poles on a magnet. They push away and therefore can move with water. And so at that point, if you start understanding how nitrogen transforms in the soil and transforms in the environment, as well as the implications of weather. So because it's microbial, it is dependent on temperature and time. And then, of course, all of our loss processes related to nitrogen are water-driven. So the two primary being either leaching it, which is moving it down through the soil profile, or denitrification, which happens under anaerobic conditions when the soil becomes completely saturated. It turns into N2 gas and just blows off into the atmosphere, which, of course, that's not an environmental contaminant. It's what we're breathing into our lungs right now, provided that conversion is complete. But obviously, then you're dealing with not having the nitrogen out there for growing the crop. And so it goes back to what I said a little bit ago, which is a lot of our recommendations were intended, they kind of look like one size fits all, when in reality this is a very dynamic situation because we're dealing with the environment, we're dealing with biological systems. So what we try to stress to farmers is, if you come to the Nitrogen Smart program, we're no longer telling you what to do. We're trying to give you enough information so you decide what to do, because that management could be very pragmatic, could change a lot from one year to the next depending on what the weather's been like, whether you've been able to get out and perform timely field operations the way you want to, whether things got delayed, and so forth. Plus, we're moving into a whole new world with technology and maybe being able to be prescriptive with nitrogen rates as far as variable rating across the landscape. A lot of that is going to happen in season. So that also kind of demands that you understand how nitrogen behaves in the environment. And so this really is a 3-hour crash on understanding how nitrogen is in the environment so that you can vary your management. There's really two outcomes of this. One is, of course, is more profitability for the farm through either increased yields or reduced inputs. But actually, the University of Minnesota research shows that where we maximize profitability is also the point at which we minimize environmental loss. The key is really to be able to hit that sweet spot of exactly what that right rate is of applied nitrogen for the crop to use, and then not over apply. Because once we start over applying, a lot of our research shows we actually leave it pound for pound just behind in the field, and then it's subject to get lost. And so that's kind of where we're at with that program.
So I think that really ties in, with, maybe even backing up a little bit to the basics of a lot of this stuff. So, Brad, maybe hit on the 4 R's, how that kind of ties into that, because that's really what you're talking about, right? You're talking about the 4 R's, and then, I think, Mark, you're seeing how you're taking those 4 R's and and shifting them to what works for you.
Right. One thing I'd like to add is he said it's an on-the-go, it's a constant evaluation. You had said it changes seasonally. It changes every few days.
Yep.
Right. You can have we're scheduled to get rain. You would just put down nitrogen, it's in the nitrate form already. And, it should have been a nice inch, and it ended up being 3.5, 4 inches. Now you got to sit down with the calculator and do math. How much was lost in that rain event? How am I going to make that up? Prior to the rain event, do you put on additional? Or do you have something in your management plan? If the rain weather goes against you in the next 10 days, 2 weeks, you've already got a backup plan that you have one more opportunity to weather a little bit more, or weather's been ideal, I'm going to back off.
Well, that's a good idea. On having that kind of backup plan and having multiple different options, I think is a good way to kind of go about thinking about this a little bit different. Thinking about my nutrient management program might shift during the year.
It will
based
shift
on the weather.
Yeah.
And making sure that we have those options, though, and not all of our eggs in that one basket. Probably a good way to be able to go about this.
Yeah. Nitrogen is a difficult nutrient to manage because of the way the nitrogen cycle works and all of that.
Right, and you get back to your discussion about the 4 R's, which is really, simply put, in Minnesota, it's our best management practices. It's just how we recommend applying fertilizer, what rate and what type of fertilizer you're using, and when you apply it, and so forth. But in the Nitrogen Smart program, toward the end of it, we throw out what we call scenarios, which is some of these gray areas or places where you have to engage your brain and start thinking about. And one of the scenarios I throw out to the attendees is, what if you've got, say, 2,000 acres that you want to fertilize, but and you know that ideally you'd like to apply your fertilizer in the spring because it minimizes the chances of loss and it's more efficient and so forth. But logistically, you just find you can't do that. You don't have enough time to apply to 2,000 acres before you're getting planting in the spring. So let's just say that you have to apply half of it in the fall, and then you have to apply half of it, and then you get to apply half of it in the spring. So how do you start prioritizing? Well, simply put, if you look at where the reason to want to apply it in the spring is because you're afraid you're going to lose that nitrogen. So now just start evaluating your fields and what the potential for loss is. Coarse textured soils that have a lot of water running through those. Places that are wet and saturated, we potentially have losses through denitrification and so forth. And we can start singling out where the places are where we probably would rather not apply in the fall. And maybe there's a lot of less risk places where we can do that application and it's going to be just fine. And so that's some of that. When I say pragmatic management, that's really it right there. It's kind of deciding on a case-by-case basis.
So when you're going through and having that conversation with farmers, is there tools that you can go through to be able to make those decisions on where do I need to really focus on the 4 R's, or does it really just have to happen on a case-by-case basis, sitting down and
I'll step in on that just a little bit. I think the biggest tool is getting the end user to understand, like you had said, the different sources of nitrogen. So the more educated they get, the more responsibility they can take on, and the better decisions they can make at the moment. Because nitrogen really does become an at-the-moment deal. I've literally called Brad when we're out applying, late-season nitrogen and chest-high corn, and talking over, well, this is what I'm doing for rates. This is what we saw. This is what we started with. Here's the decision I made. And he's, and do you think I'm validated, or should I go up, or should I go down? Did I miss something? Am I leaving something out of the loop? So he's been a great mentor in that area to help make those decisions.
Yeah, in terms of tools, I do think it is more or less case by case, and each farmer needs to work that out themselves. The technical term that NRCS uses is comprehensive nutrient management planning, and of course that's ultimately your tool, developing your own plan for what you're going to do. But really what it amounts to on an individual farmer perspective is what's at your disposal. Where you're getting fertilizer from, because in a lot of cases you don't have the entire range of products that are out on the market available all from one location. The ability to apply it, when you apply it, and so forth is also going to be a little bit different from one place to the next. A lot of farmers have acquired their own ability to do side dressing or to do their own applications. Obviously, if you don't have that ability, now you're also at the mercy of somebody else for what they have for application technology and timing and waiting in line for all of their customers and so forth. So it gets pretty individual as far as from one farmer to the next as far as what they actually can accomplish. And that's why, again, we tell farmers coming to that meeting, we're not going to tell you what to do. We're going to give you enough information you can figure it out on your own.
So when it comes to nitrogen management and trying to track what's going on your own farm, now we have some, when I say tools, in this case, I'm talking about software programs that can help us out a little bit in taking a look at what we may have for nitrogen on our farm. What's your opinion coming from a neutral source here? And both of you maybe have a lot of experience with this, but what are your opinions on how accurate some of that software is and whether or not it's a realistic tool for me as a farmer?
Yeah, I've done a fair amount of research on those products now over the last 5 or 6 years, and they seem to work fairly well as far as I can tell. Now, one of the things I think farmers tend to get wrong with respect to those programs, and I've had farmers tell me, well, we tried that and it didn't work. Well, how did it didn't work? Well, I got the same yield I got by not using it. And, then I would say, well, that program was intended to, this crop model was intended to give you a nitrogen recommendation. Right. They said they were going to accurately predict how much nitrogen you needed in the crop. It didn't say it was going to increase your yield. And so what I tend to find with a lot of these programs is they actually give the recommendation of applying lower rates of nitrogen. And so this is like a kind of a oh duh thing, but seriously, if you're applying less nitrogen, you're never going to increase your yield.
Right.
You can't. I mean, it's not going to happen. So the idea is, if it's accurately recommending the correct amount of nitrogen and it happens to be less, you'll get the same yield. And so saying that it doesn't work, well, it does work if it tells you to apply less nitrogen and you get the same yield as applying more.
Right. The idea is a model of efficiency.
Correct.
You're not going for an increased yield on something like that. What you're going for is decreased inputs. Correct. And the proper amount of inputs.
Well, and there's another thing that comes into that equation is we're just starting to understand the impact of soil health. That's where when the healthier the soil gets, its ability to manufacture nitrogen in season is incredible if Mother Nature cooperates. It's back to the variable of Mother Nature. But what I think the programs you're talking about, they're trying to stay a step ahead of the game, and I think their programs are based off of the scenario of the healthier soils.
Well, they're trying to model the processes that we talked about in the soil. Mineralization of nitrogen from the organic matter, so predicting how much is being supplied naturally through the environment. Of course, they add the inputs that you apply as fertilizer. That's pretty simple. But then they're also trying to model the loss processes. So that's a factor of soil temperature, how saturated the soil is, potentially how much is moved through the soil profile, and so forth. These are very difficult things. I mean, a lot of the research that's been done, not just in Minnesota, but across the Midwest, has found it very difficult to predict nitrogen mineralization out of soil organic matter. We know that your higher levels of organic matter, of course, have the ability to supply more nitrogen, but it's very dynamic. And so a lot of the crop model programs are kind of a black box. It's proprietary. They're not going to share that coding even with the university because it could get out and then they lose their unique product. And so we don't really know how exactly it is that they're predicting all those things. All we can do is actually use the programs and see how well they perform. Now, the one aspect of these, though, that I find quite intriguing is the big data component, that being them being able to track an individual farmer's experience over a number of years, as well as lump in what's going on with the neighbors, so that maybe they can start building a level of accuracy. You may not be able to scientifically know what's going on, but through anecdotally and how it yielded and how things performed and came down through the season, it can start making local adjustments even to an individual farmer level that are fairly accurate, and that's an intriguing aspect. They tell us that there is that component in these programs, and I guess I'm kind of waiting to see as we get maybe
really specific,
6 to 8 years down the line of using them if they really start making those types of adjustments.
I think one thing in the last kind comment you made that's really intriguing is the hypothesis that you're going to get a neighbor to tell you an honest yield.
You have that issue too, huh?
Yeah, there's a variability there that I think is even more a wonder bug than what Mother Nature.
But a lot of these programs are you're just inputting your yield data, and they stay anonymous, and they do lump that data together. I mean, some of the programs you have the ability to opt out of that feature, but quite frankly, if you're paying for it, you want the benefit from it. You may not feel like, well, I'm not sharing my data unless somebody buys it from me, but then again, you want other people's data to help you, so that it kind of gets to this give and take on
While we're on this track, is it okay if I ask him a question?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Cool. Yeah, we're all farmers in this deal. We're picking his brain and picking your brain here. So
as we move forward and learn more about what the cover crops can do to the overall soil health, is there some sort of research to determine healthier soils, I believe, can mineralize and manufacture more nitrogen than poorly managed soils, highly compacted? So is there an element that can be put out there as the university, land-grant universities researching those type of benefits from the use of cover crops?
Yes, we are. In fact, we've currently got a study using cover crops on the drainage plots at the Southern Research and Outreach Center in Waseca. And they're looking at using the cover crops for recovering any unused fertilizer that's left at the end of the season, as well as we've got this whole issue of nitrogen mineralizing out of soil organic matter post-growing season. You know, if you think about this, mostly corn black layers in southern Minnesota about Labor Day, and microbial activity doesn't really shut down until the soil temperature gets down to about 50 degrees. The average day of that in Waseca is the 25th of October. So you're continuing to see nitrogen mineralizing out of soil organic matter for 6 or 7 weeks after the crop is done picking up nitrogen. And our research has shown that as much as 2/3 of what we're losing through tile lines actually comes from this mineralized nitrogen pool. Has nothing to do with how we're applying fertilizer. And so the extent to which cover crops are able to grow after that corn crop is done growing and actually arrest that in place, that has some great potential. Now, not only to just simply reduce the amount of nitrates running through the water, but if you're actually retaining that nitrogen because the cover crop picked it up, now you kill the cover crop next year, does that mean you can start crediting that nitrogen to what you're applying the following year?
Exactly.
And that is exactly the type of research we're doing. Again, though, that is also gets back to a year-to-year thing. You know, tell me how warm it is and how wet it is. Of course, if you get a cereal rye crop out there, and then the following summer is cool and dry, you know, you probably won't get a lot of release of that at all.
Correct.
You know, and so that in and of itself is also going to require that we kind of keep track of how the climate is affecting it.
But cool and dry can also be a negative effect. It can make it difficult to manage your ammoniacal nitrogens too.
Right, and you know, and then of course the wild card and all this, we also have to acknowledge, and every farmer knows this, is based on what we get for weather, you know, we actually don't have as much yield potential some years. And so while we all would love to think we're all going to hit the high end every year, we know that some years the weather doesn't give us a set of growing conditions to get there. And so then the question is can we adapt our management for when that's the case and just apply less and still do just as well?
Well, it sounds like, Mark, you've done a lot of work on this, on figuring out what are those rates and whatnot. Maybe walk us through a little bit of that on what you've seen. It sounds like getting your soils to change and mineralizing more on their own. Something's happening.
Right. The fundamental basics of what we've implemented on our farms, we stopped any plant we raise, whether it's a cover crop or corn or soybeans, we quit pulling the root mass out of the soil. Anything we do as far as tillage, it's imperative that we leave that root mass intact. It's pure carbon. Anything we can do to raise the carbon levels of the soil, less carbon, you know, we use that plant as a carbon sink to harness CO2 out of the atmosphere and sequester it into the soil. And the minute you do tillage, within 72 hours, it vapors back into the atmosphere. So we were taught by a mentor 15 years ago, you know, whatever you do, because we were looking at, we're sketching, we're drawing, we're we're envisioning what the ideal strip till machine would look like, or the ideal tillage machine to honor certain golden rules. What is the primary golden rule in no-till or strip till or vertical tillage? It's imperative that you leave the root mass intact. It's just that simple. So we're sequestering more carbon. What's some of the values of carbon? What I was taught. A pound of carbon manages 7 pounds of water. So anything you can do to increase carbon levels in the soil is going to help manage nitrogen, because nitrogen
it's going to be in that water.
It affixes itself to water first.
Well, and I think maybe Brad, we get into you on this, that, I've been doing a lot of this research. I work with Dr. Rick Haney quite a bit on looking at building that carbon up. And the whole point there is that as you build carbon, you have the ability to hold and to cycle more nitrogen. It's that C to N ratio issues that we need to be able to put more carbon back into our soils. And maybe you have some info on where our carbon levels started, especially up here in Minnesota, are even higher than mine down in Iowa, as far as where our carbon and our organic matter levels started when we started to farm in this area. Now we need to build those carbon levels back up. And I think as we build those carbon levels, we can hold more nitrogen, hold more water, like you pointed out as well, and thus then be able to reduce some of our synthetic input because we're getting the soil to function on its own.
Yeah, we probably started about when the prairie was first plowed. It was probably 12 to 14%, and probably
organic matter.
Yeah, organic matter, probably knocked down to about 8% in about a year, and then started a slow, steady decline. Most of our soils across southern Minnesota now are about 3 to 4%. Although interesting enough, at the Research and Outreach Center in Waseca, it's stayed in at about 6%. So we actually are dealing, but here's the kicker on this. So it's got 6% organic matter. Yet we find at the Research and Outreach Center in Waseca, typically we end up needing higher nitrogen rates to maximize crop yields.
Because you have all that added carbon, though, too.
It could be, but I think it's also a factor of the clay loam soils. And so we have to acknowledge that you've got a heavier soil, it's colder, slower to release, slower to mineralize, as well as enhanced loss processes. So when it stays saturated and it gets wet and it just stays wet and sticky for a couple of weeks, you're going to be denitrifying nitrogen out of there. And so, it's not a one-size-fits-all. We can't just simply say, yep, you increase your organic matter by 3% and just cut the amount of nitrogen you apply by 30 pounds. That's going to vary depending on the site. And
I couldn't agree with that more. Our soils on our farms are extremely variable. My organic matters go from 1% to 8%. So it's right.
What's some of your tips on how'd you figure that out? How'd you figure out how much nitrogen then you need in those different scenarios?
Process of trial and error. I started out with lots of sulfate-based nitrogen available. We did a lot of pork production, so we worked with them, and we found the sulfate-based nitrogens were most beneficial on our low organic matter soils. It was a very very stable source of nitrogen. So,
not to mention that you needed sulfur fertilizer
in those lower organic matter soils.
Right.
You needed sulfur too.
Right.
Yeah, but there's no. I guess out of this, the one thing you're going to get is there's no silver bullet. It's trial and error. I guess I probably started over applying. I was just too high, and we just started cutting back. And
what'd some of that look like, to put some number? And we don't have to get too into it, but just for reference,
striving for 220 bushel corn, we were targeting commercial fertilizer to be up in that 1.2, 1.3 pounds per bushel expected, and within fields, as we started handling more of it ourselves, we started dropping the rates down, even if it was just for one round.
Sure.
Cut the rate, and then you come back through with the yield monitor or weigh wagon, and you weigh it off, going, did I short myself?
So you're putting in your own little check strips and whatnot.
Lots of that. Every year, I've been planting crops for almost 40 years now. I started young and always had a passion for it, but it was constantly checks, lots of checks, thousands of checks.
Mark jokes about him being one of the few farmers that I actually have to get on their case to apply more nitrogen. So I think where are you at right now for a lot of your nitrogen rates? Corn falling beans, you're what, 90 thereabouts?
Yes.
Yeah.
Per bushel, our goal is I'm trying to get 0.6 of a pound of commercial nitrogen applied for bushel harvested, and you're not going to know that until you get to harvest.
Does any of that change depending on, say, organic versus synthetic fertilizers? I mean, organic versus synthetic nitrogen and what you're using there. Does any of that goal change when you say 0.6 of a pound?
Yes, because you got to keep in mind with your organics, again, they're sulfate-based. We use quite a bit of turkey litter now. And depending on what Mother Nature deals you as far as soil temperatures, how soon does the soil warm up, how frequent the rains are, did you have excessive rains, how much of that sulfate base is going to be available the first year. So it's kind of a guessing game, but primarily that 0.6 is based on commercial nitrogen that's applied.
Sure.
You know, Mark talked about trying to target getting 0.6 of a pound of nitrogen per bushel produced. And I think a lot of people, if they've not paid attention to this, you've still got that stuck in your head that you need a pound or 1.2 pounds per bushel. The truth of the matter is that there's actually been a trend line that's been going back now for decades on decreased amounts of nitrogen necessary per bushel produced. Now, some of this has probably been because of reduced amounts of protein in the grain, but that's not a component we're paid for.
We're not paid on the quality of that grain.
That's
right.
exactly right. But actually, the trend line right now, if you look at it, is we're right around statewide, we're right around 0.7 of a pound of nitrogen per bushel produced. And so when he says 0.6, that's really not that far off if you start adding in what he's getting from his mineralized sources. You know, as long as he's being very efficient with his application, you know, most corn, obviously, it needs some nitrogen at the time of germination and to get off for early growth, and it's very sensitive to the fact that the root system is very small and it's got to be pretty close to the roots. But most nitrogen use isn't until we get to depending on the year, but roughly about the 10th of June.
Yeah, putting on ears. And
right. So you've got a lot of flexibility. The closer you go to that time, the less chance there is to lose it. And then if you're going to be real prescriptive with your rates, that also gives you the ability to flex and adjust if you think you need higher or lower rates, depending on how the year's shaking out.
I would assume that both of you have done a lot of work with variable applications of nitrogen and split application stuff.
Correct, yep.
Is there a time, so I farm on pretty heavy clay soils,
Yep.
high exchange capacity soils, which I know is an oversimplification of understanding how much nitrogen the soil can hold, but to give you an idea, I'm up in the mid to high 20s on my CEC numbers.
Okay.
Heavy clay soils, cold temperatures. Is there ever a time that you guys feel putting on one application, the full application of nitrogen in one shot, is okay?
No.
Well, we're gonna disagree on this because the research at Waseca actually shows 4 out of 5 years that's fine.
Okay.
And that's clay loam soils, and so the key on that is, so you've got the 1 out of 5 is 20% having a loss or a reduction acceptable to you? Are you over fertilizing to compensate for that 1 out of 5?
Right.
Because that's an issue. But then the other part of that is, can we pick those years out? Now, the other part of that, though, is that's using, I guess, what I would consider to be a little bit higher rates. So when I talked a lot earlier in the podcast about how most of our recommendations are based on encompassing most situations. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're reducing your rates to really be a little more exact with your actual rate, now you're getting into the territory where you may see a responsiveness to side dressing versus all pre-applying it because of lower rates. That dynamic may change. That's really where Mark is at when he says no. If you're only applying 90 pounds to corn fowling beans, you're going to see a response to side dress in terms of it being a better application method way more often than if you're applying 120 or 140, because that extra amount of nitrogen gives you the slough to be able to have a bad year, lose some of it, and you never knew the difference. Mm-hmm. Now, the other aspect of that, that's important to recognize if we're using variable rate nitrogen is, and you're trying to be prescriptive with that, and you're trying to change the amount of nitrogen that you're applying as you go across the field based on some factors, the further we get along in the growing season, the better idea we have on what those factors are, what our weather's been like, what the yield potential of that crop is like.
Why limit yourself? It'd be like picking your favorite football team because the quarterback, every time he passed the ball, he went for a Hail Mary. They don't win games that way. Why would you blow your total budget on one shot with all these variables ahead of you and your budget's already been spent?
Right, when you don't necessarily know.
Now, the one factor we haven't talked about, and you don't hear many people talk about this, late season nitrogen application gives you the opportunity to evaluate the crop. What's your yield potential? Ballpark. What's your target?
Like right now,
Yeah.
for me to say, sitting in the studio right now in the middle of February, for me to say my yield potential, I mean, all I can do is
some
give
sort
you
of a target
Sure, yeah. I mean, I can
based
say
off of history.
yes. I mean, on our good fields where we farm, if we hit 190 or 200, I mean that's we're going to be happy with that.
All right.
Potential is much higher than that, but
We scout extensively throughout the growing season. If we have ideal planting conditions, we have an ideal emergence, we have a great June. Good. We didn't abuse it. We didn't beat up the plant from 5-inch rainfalls coming towards the end of June. When I'm getting up there on shoulder high corn, we're evaluating the crop and we're going, geez, based on our P levels, our K levels, all the work we've done with balancing the pH, this hybrid here has the potential to do 350 bushel. So 0.6 per bushel of nitrogen. You blew your total budget early on. You have no plan for late season nitrogen application. You're going to say, well, okay, we'll see what happens, or you're going to go back in there and you're going to put some nitrogen on
Give
and
it the
chase.
best chance of success.
Right. We're going to manage this thing, and we're going to give the highest probability of success.
Are you using any? So I wanted to maybe see on what are the specifics that you're using there to be able to help to make that decision. Are you using like any kind of tech tools or even an Excel spreadsheet or anything like that, or just kind of doing some quick math? in
No,
your head?
leverage your agronomists. Get
Yeah.
agronomists you work with that understand and know their hybrids they're working with.
You have a consultant that you work with, right?
Yes.
And having me on your speed dial. But
Yeah.
Yes. But to evaluate, to know your genetic potential, you had a great season, and the forecast, weather forecast is getting more accurate 5-6 weeks out. We get into the third week of June, we get accurate weather forecasts into the first week of August.
Mark and I were actually talking about this morning, the extent to which we can start using those the National Weather Service 1 month and 3 month forecasts when we start getting to the point where we're going to make some decisions and say colder than normal, warmer than normal, wetter than normal, drier than normal. Can that actually start advising how we're going to make that last application if we're split applying?
And I think we can. I think it's getting
for
better.
sure.
I think
And Brad, that was kind of what I was thinking too on what are some of the tools you talked about, some of the like different ag tech kind of tools. Some of them are big data, but what are some of those other ones that you think that we can modify the curves based on this weather data? And as we train the machine learning systems with better weather data, what are some of those tools that you're looking at now, but also maybe in the future?
So you're talking about like the crop models, for instance?
Different crop models
So like Pioneers is in Circa. Monsanto has the Field Scripts program. There's AdaptN is a program that was developed at Cornell a number of years ago. Has since been commercialized. Winfield has R7. I've worked with that one also. All of these programs are tracking the weather, and they're basically running a crop model that if we add so many heat units, we add so much water, so much fertility, we're predicting how much the crop is going to grow and therefore what the status is. And then, of course, they're trying to model what's going on in the soil also. So there's that whole aspect. There's a couple other technologies out there. We've worked some with the soil testing methods, the in-season soil testing. That's really been kind of variable, and I think the part of the biggest problem with that is it's kind of expensive. I mean, taking soil samples 2 foot, well, for one thing, the commercial products are telling you to sample 1 foot deep. Now, university research has shown that a lot of that nitrogen can be down between 1 and 2 feet, and if you only sample 1 foot, you're kind of missing it. But taking 2 foot soil samples during the growing season can really be a drag. I mean, no one really likes to do that. Then you got the issue of drying it and analyzing it and all that. But regardless, that technology's out there. We've seen some potential with it, but we've seen some real drawbacks of that. And the last one is the sensing technologies. Both the active sensors like the green seeker or crop circle that mounts on a piece of equipment, it basically measures how yellow the crop is and then sends a signal through some algorithm to how much nitrogen to apply out the back of it. Passive sensors like sending a drone up in the air, taking a still image, and then having some computer program analyze.
Like the green seeker type technology?
Well, that was the active sensors would be the green seeker, but passive would be like taking drone images.
Imagery.
Or red edge or whatever it is you want to do. We've really not seen a lot of potential with the sensing technologies in Minnesota. They've seen a little better use of that farther south. The problem with those technologies is really kind of two things. One is by the time we start seeing color changes in the crop, we've typically lost yield. Some of the long season hybrids that you would see, say, in Missouri and further south, 120-day, actually have the ability to recover some of that. So when you see some of this data and it comes out of Missouri or Arkansas or Kentucky, and they say, yeah, but they did it and it looked great. Well, but you're not growing 124-day corn hybrids either. You're growing 95. Yeah. So there's that aspect of it that really kind of limits, and then there's the whole timeliness of the thing too. I mean, how much time does it take to get the image, process it, and then order up your fertilizer and have it applied? Sometimes that's several days and so forth. So sensing has a place. We're going to keep researching it, but I think we're most intrigued right now by the crop models because I think the technology there is pretty sound. It really kind of gets back to this whole accuracy, again, to things that we've not been able to really predict through research. We can't really accurately predict nitrogen mineralization out of soil organic matter through research, and so it's kind of difficult to think that some black box computer model is doing a really good job of it. But the proof is in the pudding. A lot of the projects that we've used, for instance, I did one trial last year, not this past growing season, the year before. We used 3 different products, and for instance, like the Encirca product from Pioneer, it came back with a recommendation that was 100% below university recommendations. The entire field, it said lower rates, and the R7 product from Winfield was like 92% of the field said to apply less. And we had, for instance, one of the strips that we harvested out of that, 12 rows wide, 1,800 feet long. We had 277 bushels an acre on 152 pounds nitrogen corn on corn. So did it work? Well, it obviously did. That certainly wasn't a yield failure, and it said use this much nitrogen, and we got 278 bushels an acre. And so I think the
that was coupled with late season application.
It was side dress, sure. It was sure. It was applied at about V4 to V6. I think it might have been V6 in that particular instance. So I think the thing though that I'm really still cautious about with these is how they do in adverse conditions. Last year, we were really looking forward to the results of this study, and then it turned out that the field that we had the project on got hit by a tornado on the 20th of September, and we kind of lost it. We got data, but I'm not sure that I want to trot it out and use it. But we really need more of these types of trials going on in challenging years and challenging conditions before we can just pronounce a judgment on them and say, yep, they work, go ahead, boys, take whatever you want and run with it. Right. Yeah.
Well, it comes back to his question a couple of minutes ago that, can I got high CEC soils, can I just put on one application rate? And is there ever a time where I'm justified in just doing it and not worrying about it? And back to my answer, no. Why would you give up all that potential?
Well, I think a part of it is the difficulty of, split application. There's a difference between farming on paper and farming with the software, and then the art of actually getting the work done. And when you have 2,400 acres, like in my case, where we have 2,400 acres to do with just Dad and I mean, when it comes down to boots on the ground, somebody's driving that tractor, somebody's handling the materials, we've got to have the physical labor and the timing and the equipment to be able to get all of this done.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's difficult to balance that at the same time.
And that's something that I mentioned earlier, surveying just what you have at your disposal.
Right.
And the ability to actually get that much applied is a factor that you need to consider before just saying, well, I'm going to go apply everything at V6. Well, last year was a year where we had extreme challenges with as wet as it was in some parts of the state. Guys literally could not get back in the field to apply splits. Now, in some of those cases, the crop didn't yield worth a darn anyway because it was so wet and there wasn't anything to be rescued.
Right,
exactly.
But that is part of your risk management is what is the risk, not just what is the risk of losing nitrogen, therefore I benefit from having a split application, but what is my risk of not being able to get out in the field and apply it at all, in which case I've only got a half rate out there. Now what have I got? So yeah, it's a bit of a balancing.
We've seen it more than once, though, Brad, where the stuff is all applied up front. Those extreme wet conditions come through, and you lost 90% of your pre-applied.
I don't know if I go with 90%, Mark, but
let's
high
call it
half.
50%.
Yeah, okay, yeah, right.
Any little bit is more than we want to lose.
At 2014, I guess we did maybe lose 90% in some circumstances.
Southwestern Minnesota, I bet, lost more than 50%.
This year, if you got down by Sherburne, Jackson, that area, it's very possible.
Yes.
Yeah, it's possible.
Well, Mark and Brad, thank you guys for coming in. This has been this has been a great conversation. We're going to have more talks about nutrient management in the future. But for today, we're going to wrap this podcast up. I thank you guys again for coming in. This has been fun.
And the whole point, of our podcast here too is to be able to foster conversation. Why don't leave the listeners with where to go to get more information or to carry on the conversation with you guys too.
Sure. Well, I'm easy to get a hold of. I work out of the Regional Extension Office in Mankato. So if you want to call me, my phone number is 507-389-6745. My email address is very simple. It's bcarlson@umn.edu. And you can also find out information on the Nitrogen Smart program at z, as in zebra, z.umn.edu/Nitrogen Smart, all one word. And that's where all the, you can both take the online course there and see the schedule for the in-person workshops.
Right. My advice would be to farmers to get to, like Jody Dijon Hughes puts on these conventions that are based on reduced tillage and soil health type seminars and stuff. They really are a good place to get a wealth of information and meet other guys that are active in it. These farmer panels they got going, they get a lot of great discussion, and it literally puts a face to somebody's ideas and methodologies of what they're doing. So they got the opportunity to approach them after their little dog and pony show is done in the audience later on, buy him a cocktail in the evening and pick his brain. Incredible wealth of information. I call it salt of the earth information, but the guy's he's fighting the fight. He's making it happen. He's making it work.
Really appreciate you guys coming on. There's tons of stuff. We could obviously sit here for a lot more hours, and we barely scratched the surface on some of this stuff. So really good conversation to have, and we'll keep on digging into things here on the Fieldwork Podcast going forward.
All right, good luck.
Great.
Thanks
for
guys.
having us.